Hey, Christy? Christy! Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be today. Thank you so very much for joining us, whether you're here live this morning at 10 a.m. Pacific, or if you are joining us later on the recording version of this stuff. I am very excited today as we start to prepare for 2025. We have a fantastic year planned ahead for the TeamFlow Institute and hopefully the world in terms of advancing us towards a more brighter, brilliant, greater for everyone future of work. Which has been part of my kind of mission and purpose for almost 30 years now. And I am delighted today to actually be joined by, well, one of the brilliant minds in workforce transformation that I've ever met, who I've had the pleasure to meet through Jen McClure. But before I bring him up on stage, I just want to talk a brief moment about our TeamFlow Institute and our research fellowship program that is being head up and run by Jen McClure, a fantastic professional, former digital transformation leader at Thomson Reuters, and so many other things. But Jen and I met through her organization, SNCR, the Society for New Communications Research, which she stood up to study with a great number of other, I don't know that they were called fellows per se, but amazing researchers, smart futurists, and thought leaders in exploring what this new world of communication looked like as we started to enter the world of social media. At that same time, I was working on Social Media Club, a professional organization, a global nonprofit, to bring people together to learn from one another. And in many ways, while we didn't have tons of official collaborations on different things, we informally collaborated on a numerous number of initiatives and events. I was very fortunate to attend her conferences, which is where I actually met our guest today, Steve King, for the first time in Boston, I think back in 2007. But anyways, I'm talking on a little bit much. Let me tell you, the Research Institute Fellows Program, with TeamFlow, we were very fortunate to connect with one of the pioneers in TeamFlow, Dr. Jeff Vandenhout out of Eindhoven University in Amsterdam, who's written some incredible white papers and research papers on this subject. We're very fortunate to have him involved, but we've recruited an interdisciplinary board of futurists, of fellows to help with our research program. This past year, we've published 3 really awesome reports looking at the concepts of AI, ethical AI, how AI impacts the future of work, and more importantly, the nature of human work and what it's going to take for us to actually successfully integrate AI into our workforce, not as a replacement, but as a tool for augmentation. As we look ahead, there is a lot of challenges facing large organizations and small, and that's what we're going to get into today. And we'll talk a little bit more about the 5 trends affecting the nature of work, the future of work, that workforce transformation I was talking about, developed by Steve King with his research with some amazing companies on top of that. Let me go ahead and bring him up here now. Steve, I hope I did a reasonable introduction for you there. Going a little fast as we were just talking. I got some adrenaline flowing, so I'll breathe. But welcome. Why don't you go ahead and do a little better introduction on yourself and what you've been doing these last few years to help kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I'm Steve King. I'm a partner in a firm called Emergent Research. We're a research and consulting firm, and our focus is on the future of work. We've been around 25 years now, so a long time, and that's really the future of work. And we have a focus on independent workers, freelancers, gig economy workers, independent contractors, small businesses. But as part of that, we also get to study large corporations and how they're utilizing this. And that's just a quick overview of who I am. So we've been doing future work for a long time.
Awesome. Well, and again, and that's actually one of the other circles where I know Steve's work from back in the day. And one of the things I want to start with before we get into the topic, because it's near and dear to my personal heart, having experienced this, is if you could just kind of explain this idea of the blended workforce, because that is one of the topics you've been really studying and I think deserves a lot more attention than it's getting.
Yeah, we'll go into this a little more in depth later with some data, but basically the blended workforce is the fact that non-employee labor, which includes freelancers and independent consultants, but also other forms of non-employee labor, the use of that by companies large and small, and I'll have some data on this later on, has basically dramatically gone up over the last decade. We did our first studies on this in 2010, 2011, and I'll show you a chart later on. In 2012, it was about 20. When you ask corporations what share of their workforce is actually not employees, but some form of outside labor, it was 21%. And in our most recent survey this year, it was 39%. And of course, companies, many companies are well over 50%. Google publishes their numbers and they're at about 57 the last time I looked. And so it's just a fundamental shift in how companies use labor. And of course, that ripples down to work teams, and we'll come back to that.
Yeah, and the reason why I wanted to set up that in particular up front is because there is that specific definition of it. And people could think of blended as intergenerational. They could think of blended as remote hybrid and in these other stuffs, but they are uniquely different because what happens is, and what my experience is, and where I want to do this as a contractor inside of a large organization working at a higher level, I had the experience of being an outsider, and I didn't have the same authority and respect. And while my friends who I worked with closely treated me as a team member because we were, the rest of the company didn't. And so it was a real challenging experience. And I just believe through my own experience that if companies do better at that, they're going to do better overall. And it is a cultural issue, but it's also a policy issue. And of course, it was my legal status that really created that kind of differentiation or boundary. Anyways, enough of that. Let's get into actually the topic for the day. So the 5 trends shaping the future of work is a recent research report that Steve produced. When we were talking with him about it, now about a month and a half, 2 months ago, I guess, we realized that this was really a foundational piece that we should look into further, particularly as we're trying to advance the culture and philosophies of team flow as a sort of an objective for companies seeking higher performance. And that is in terms of not only the bottom line and the top line, but also the well-being of the workforce. And what is it going to take for smart people to work well together to produce greater success? And so as we get into this here, the 5 trends, I'm just going to introduce them for you, and then I'm going to turn it over. Are the shift to hybrid remote work, which we're all dealing with. We'll talk more deeply about that. That's something also I've been working on as well. That blended workforce we were just talking about a moment ago. Digital transformation, and of course now with AI and what we're looking at. The multi-generational workforce that we also is very important component of this. As some of you may know, the differences between us Gen Xers who are in leadership roles and Gen A and some of the Gen Z is quite vast in terms of expectations in some cases. And then the broader shift to project-based work in agile teams. And so what we've been doing in our research over the past year is exploring more specifically the role that AI plays and trying to advance the notion of the value of human work. What can humans uniquely contribute to this? And of course, as you look at all of this, all of these factors affect that. And so as we further that, when we saw Steve's work, we realized that this was a great guide to help focus on the specific challenges that are being faced by the C-suite. And Steve, I want to just kick you off and ask you this kind of question, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to go into a bit more. We'd love a kind of quick overview of the topics, better than what I did, because I just kind of named them, to be able to explain what really is going on in each of these. Or if the occasion so moves you, Steve, and you want to spend a little more time on each, and we just start going through them, that's fine too. Whatever moves you appropriately this morning. But we are going to look at each of these topics in more depth in the year ahead. We are going to be doing a monthly series of conversations like this from each of our fellows' perspectives on these various topics, intersecting from their point of view and expertise with this kind of common theme across these trends, and through that specific lens of how achieving team flow can improve team performance. And of course, organizational performance through that. And across the year, we're actually also initiating a number of research projects that will hopefully be sponsored at some point to be able to go even deeper, working with corporate partners and other large organizations to be able to generate real insights from real data to go even further, because our goal, and Steve and I talked about this quite a bit yesterday and over time, is really to make the impact to make this work better for everyone. It's great to be out here and doing this stuff with great internal personal passion for it, but it's really about that impact of people being able to have the right knowledge to do the right things and to have the right sort of outcomes. I get a little flowery, Steve. I'm sorry about that, but
that's great.
So please take it away. Tell me a little bit. Oh, here's the first question. I'm sorry. Tell me a little bit about how you came to these trends, and then please let's hear some of your perspective on this.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I was reading an article this morning from Axios, and they have an article that talks about the great upheaval, and just let me quote from that article because I found it really interesting. They said, more change across more parts of our life at more speed than ever before. Now, they were talking about geopolitical shifts and larger macro trends and larger macro shifts. But as we've been studying the future of work, we very quickly realized years ago that we were entering a period of truly exponential change in a way that we hadn't before. And change has always been a constant, and change has always been increasing in speed. But we identified these five, and we study many trends, but narrowed it down to five major ones. And the thing that's really interesting to us is that much like the great upheaval, we also have effectively almost a great disconnect with work, which is Gallup and others are showing that disengagements at all-time lows, interest in working in other places at all-time highs. Our own research shows that there's more interest in becoming self-employed today than there has been in the last 20 years, which is the length we've been studying that issue. And so we're seeing a fundamental shift in the speed at which it's shifting within work. It makes the internet look like that was slow and gradual and kind of, took a long time. And so that's what attracted me initially to the Team Flow Institute, because while we study these trends at a high level, it's where the rubber hits the road as work teams now need to figure out how to deal with all of these. Next slide, please. And the interesting thing about trends and shifts that we've learned over the years is that each of these shifts, while they're important in their own right, and you have to look at them in their own right and changing how work teams operate, it's when shifts and trends come together, it's when they converge and reinforce one another that you get exponential change. And the interconnected nature of these trends is leading to exponential change. And so we believe that work teams and the way companies are managed is going to have to dramatically shift over the next decade. In particular, but even in real time today. And we're part of many work teams with our clients, and we're obviously non-employee labor, but we're in many work teams. And so we see the challenges that managers face today. We see how hard it is to keep their groups on track. And so we need new tools and new capabilities. And that's what we're here for at the Team Flow Institute. So let me stop there and see if you have any reaction to that.
Well, I do, because, we have been working towards a more holistic approach to organizational design and management for some time. And, that's not how the world generally, looks to these things, right? It is actually about the specific issue that each of them are focusing on. And so, how are companies going to be able to wrestle with all of this, or what is the practical way that companies are going to address these 5 trends? Is it about the C-suite, everyone having a sort of remit and going out, or how are we going to actually solve for all of this complexity, given the largesse of the impacts?
Oh, you're asking me that? I thought you guys
Yes.
were the expert on that.
Well,
I from my perspective, the basic thing is that corporate lines are now fluid. We used to have corporations; they used to be their own things. That it's now fluid in between, and more of a mesh than it is a traditional line of control. And so, my own personal view is you have to devolve power down to lower and lower levels and become more decentralized. And there are a lot of examples of that. Higher in China is like the poster child of that. But to me, that's what you have to do. And then you have to have small teams that are very effective at what they do. But one of the reasons I'm at the Team Flow Institute is to learn from you guys how to do this.
Excellent. Well, and I think that's the point, and that's where I actually started thinking, like you mentioned earlier, about the future of work is in the 1-to-1 collaboration, or in the 1-to-2, or the 1-to-3, and of course there's a lot of difficulties in the way teams work today. In particular, we can look at meetings and the impact of remote work on meetings and meeting culture as a result. And we still have, even remote, these meetings that require 40 people to show up and 2 people are talking. And that just doesn't make much sense practically. So one of the other things we're looking at is how we might evolve meetings to become collaborative conversations of smaller groups of the 2 or 3 people that are the people that need to talk and do more work with it. But without that broader environment, without the policies, without the permissions to be able to do the things that they need, without that safety of being able to speak up and speak openly, that's a real challenge. So I just got one more question for you before we jump back into the slides and start examining each of the topics, and that is the C word, culture. A lot of people, and Sandy in particular, talks about the idea that culture eats strategy for lunch and that sort of thing here. But it seems to be still something that most organizations don't invest in. So what are you seeing in terms of the workforce transformation people that you engage with and that are your clients and that you do the research with in regards to their approach and attitudes towards culture?
Culture is an interesting topic. When you're in the C-suite, you hear a lot of talk about culture, how to maintain culture, what's the right culture effectively. And what you have right now is a lot of the shifts are challenging traditional cultures in so many different ways. And return to office is obviously the example that gets the most press, where you have a lot of senior executives saying, we need everybody back in the office. And you have pretty much everybody that works for them saying, no, we don't. And that leads to, and they're saying it for culture reasons. And the employees, even their senior executives, are saying, no, not really. And so and these shifts challenge culture in so many ways. We talked about, you mentioned the multi-generational aspect of it. Gen Z has very different views on what culture should be than most boomers do, or people in the middle. Across the board, all of these trends are shifting culture. And so to me, the challenge now, if you're a CEO, is with the speed of business change. On top of that, you have to figure out how to identify the type of culture you want and make sure that you communicate that culture and that ripples through. And that's one of the huge challenges right now.
That's so true. And actually, when you said that, I realized, because we're working on trying to figure out how to explain this to people. And one of the ways we've really landed on it is the idea of the speed of flow. What's the maximum sort of progressivity or productivity we can get? And with that, the majority of the return to office movement is really about management by observability and control. Mm-hmm. And we know that doesn't produce the highest quality knowledge work.
Right.
The best quality knowledge work comes from self-management, self-engagement, intrinsic motivators. And in fact, that's what turned me on to pursuing the work with Dr. Vandenhout and trying to amplify this further, because at the center of Team Flow is this idea of a collective ambition. how do we actually enumerate that? How do we keep coming back to that as a touchstone so that that vision and purpose of our collective ambition is animating all of our activity and operations? And so this is where, we're still trying to figure out how to introduce team flow to more people, of course, because it's not widely understood yet. But it is one of those things when we say it, we're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, Csikszentmihalyi's work, flow, optimal state, sounds great. But what we have to do is we have to break this down a little bit better because, again, you can't handle it all at once. So that's where the 5 trends come in. Steve, I'd love you to get started and just jump right into talking about these trends, and let's jump into it.
All right, let's go to the next slide. Everybody's sort of reasonably familiar with remote work at this point, and now the return to office policies, which basically are knee-jerk reactions to people being out of the office and executives and even managers now wondering, how do I manage these teams, and am I managing these teams successfully, and can we do better if we were back in the office? And so, but I do put this in the knee-jerk reaction to a sudden shift that they don't understand. And the data here is comes from the work from home research group led by a guy named Nick Bloom, who's a Stanford professor. And if you do Nick Bloom work from home research or Nick Bloom remote work, this website will pop up. They do monthly surveys of both companies and employees. And it's about the best source of information on remote work that's out there. And as you can see, we've kind of plateaued for a number of months. I mean, going back almost to January of 2021. And it's about 28% of full-time days are now worked from home. And his survey includes a broad cross-section of large, small, and medium-sized organizations and employees that work for them. And so that the hybrid still is kind of one, but there's a lot of tug and pull. And of course, still one of the big problems is, how do I manage these remote teams as part of my daily work as a frontline manager? And then the senior executives, you were talking about the cultural part, is absolutely right. How do I go ahead and how do I maintain culture and efficiency in this remote work world? So obviously a big important trend. And so I don't think I have to go deeper on it. Chris, what do you think?
Well, I agree, and I see this, and of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, we worked on a remote guild for remote workers called Remotely. So I spent a bit of time trying to understand it more closely, and having been working remotely for some time now, it was pretty obvious to me how much more advantageous it could be. But that didn't take into account the younger generation and their need for socialization, their need to learn. In this case, I'm coming at it from a perspective of an experienced professional. I know what needs to be done. I know how to interact with people over Zoom and in person, and it's not a problem. Whereas the younger generations are still learning many of these skills. So that's part of the need to look after the intergenerational and blended workforce, of course. But the challenge with return to office right now is that it is a battle of cultures of control and empowerment. Mm-hmm. And the organizations that trust their people and that they hired the right people and they trained them properly and they set them up for success, they're going to have a much greater time being hybrid or fully remote or whatever it might be. And that requires different points of view, different activities, different operational frameworks than an in-person thing. But in many ways, I still feel that this RTO movement, this return to office movement, is about fighting back for the world that was, because it was really easy to manage your employees when all you had to do was look and see if they were in their cubicle, as opposed to really understand if they were actually producing and contributing value. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of other reasons out there, but certainly I do know that some of the larger RTO stuff that we'll be seeing in the year ahead is driven by a desire to get people to quit. And an organization that is trying to get their best and smartest people to quit is not a good organization, in my view.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, real shame. But anyways, so I'm sorry, I didn't look at the next slide. Do we go to the next slide now?
Yeah, go to the next slide, please. We talked about the blended workforce earlier, and I it's interesting to me. Oftentimes, you have these teams now that has suppliers, they have customers, they have consultants, they have other outside folks. I even, for one of our large corporate clients, a few years ago, it was before COVID, I was asked to lead a cross-functional team within their company because they looked around and they had to find somebody who knew all the people that would be involved, or at least the department heads of all the people being involved, and had managerial experience. And I was the only one that fit their bill. And so they hired me to run this team for about 6 months. And that's just increasingly common. So it's not just that these people are team members, but oftentimes they can be team leaders. And obviously, if you're not an employee, you have a very different set of objectives, goals, things you want to accomplish than you do if you are an employee. And so managing blended teams, and also span of control. I was the team leader. None of these people worked for me, and never would. They were afraid of me because I knew the CEO and knew the board. But outside of that moral suasion thing, I didn't really have any power. So that becomes a much more complicated process than just running a team of employees. Now, one of the things where we see the trends merging is the shift to remote work has empowered companies to hire more freelancers and independent workers, because once you've gotten over the hurdle of the people aren't going to be in the office all the time, you're much more willing to say, oh, we could outsource that to a freelancer. We could outsource that to a third party. And so this is blended teams and remote work are actually reinforcing trends that drive each other, and again, lead to exponential change.
So you brought up, there's actually another thing in here, and I don't want to get too deep into cross-functional teams, but there are more cross-functional teams and organizations needed these days because of where does that knowledge lie, as you were saying, and that creates its own unique challenges. But why do you think it is, or why do you know it is really, probably from your experience, that there aren't a lot of people in organizations who really understand and have the relationships across the different departments?
Mainly two things. One, people are used to being siloed, and so they are in their silos and don't think about it. And then there's a lack of understanding of the need to network across organizations, and organizations don't always encourage that either way. One of the other groups we work with is a firm that does leadership studies, and they've just come out with a major study on the need for senior executives to be cross-functional. And when they told me they were working on that, I said, what? Don't all senior executives know that? And it turned out they are one of the most popular Harvard Business Review articles of the last year, because senior executives don't know that, or a lot of them don't know that. And so the growing importance of cross-functional teams is pretty clear out there. But again, other things change faster than humans. And so the human beings still need to do the work and still need to understand that this change is happening, the importance. So I think it's a combination of siloed organizations and people having their heads down and saying, I don't really need to know anybody over in the production department because I don't do production. And that's just not true.
Yeah, it's also, I think, in reflecting in that, it's a matter of, you get what you measure. And if people are being measured on a specific thing, and that's not one of the things they're measuring in terms of relationships across the company, they're likely not to get it. I just want to cite one important piece of work that's really near and dear to my heart, Keith Ferrazzi's work on co-elevation and this idea of being able to build those relationships. And one of the key tactics he suggests is to develop a relationship action plan in order to go off and introduce yourself, help these people across the organization. And if we can help them, then when the time comes, they'll be able to help us. But I went aside for a second. I want to come back to the trend itself and the blended workforce component of it. Because again, that legal status, I mean, literally the color of my badge was different. And that's how when I walked around, everyone knew I wasn't one of them. And so what are the strategies that organizations can use besides maybe giving everyone the same badge, which is more a tactic, I understand. But what are some of the strategies that organizational leaders can use to better integrate that sort of blended workforce?
Yeah, there's a lot of little things. This is what in corporations that are successful at this, and we've done a lot of work with companies that hire externals non-employees. The most important thing is actually including them in team functions. And they don't have to be everything, but trying to include them in team functions. It's providing feedback to them is very important, because a lot of times the non-employee doesn't get any feedback on how they're doing. And so if they're not fitting or if they're not culturally accurate, they need feedback on that. And so having feedback systems that give them, making sure that they have, relatively speaking, the same set of freedom of action as the employees have in terms of the autonomy and control they have over their work. And then you also want to integrate them in a way where they understand that they are part of the team. A lot of non-employee labor people are there because they're not necessarily really good at human-to-human interaction. So it might even take a little more effort to make sure they understand their role. But the biggest thing is just treat them as you would employees. And if you treat them as you would employees, you're going to be better off. Now, the legal issue is, historically, the lawyers have said if you treat them like employees, they'll be able to sue us, and that's a problem. The law has actually been clarified over the last decade, and including people in parties and having the same color badge and giving them reviews and all of those things. Those no longer are reasons in almost all jurisdictions in the United States. The legal stuff's very complex, but those are all things that no longer affect misclassification of the worker and incur legal risk. And so you've also got to work with your lawyers to make sure they're up to date on the most recent rules.
Yeah, and so there's another component of that. I just want to stay on this for another minute before we move forward, or another 2-3 minutes, because the financial aspect goes along with that legal aspect. I actually ran a roundtable. I ran a World Cafe of CEOs from large to medium-sized organizations for a I don't know what to call them, an analyst firm, something like that, where they had hosted their conference. And in that, we were talking about this issue of headcount reduction to be able to satisfy the financial markets and the average cost per employee, and the need for executives to often hire those people back as contractors at double the rate for half the work. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of talking about the absurdity of that whole thing. And I've got to tell you, most of those CEOs were just like, what do you mean it's absurd? It's what we need to do. We have to cut our costs, and we have to, go from 1,000 to 500 people or whatever. And so it's also that mindset about those financial components of what those employees mean. And I was just, because you mentioned more people wanting to work for themselves. Of course, I'm part of a couple of fractional firms as well, but that rise of fractional and that seems to be more prevalent now. So how is it that organizations are going to get beyond that idea of the headcount reduction for cost that ends up costing them more? Or just what's your perspective on it? And what do organizations really need to do about that?
You've asked a pretty complex question.
I'm sorry, yes.
I'll try to answer.
Not clear either, so any answer is good.
Relatively low income workers can be replaced with outside services of various kinds and save the corporation money. That's why we had outsourcing in the 20 years ago got hot, contract manufacturing, whatever you want to call it. Relatively low income wage jobs actually can be successfully outsourced, and it'll lead to a cost savings. But as you move up the wage scale, that starts to turn around, and actually on a per day or week or even annualized basis, a lot of higher income people cost more by using them through external labor. And so companies have to be careful and start to talk about what we call workforce optimization. They have to figure out where it makes sense to use outside labor and what that means to their bottom line. Now, outside labor also provides greater levels of flexibility and agility in their business. And that's really important in a world where things are changing quickly. And outside labor is a cost of goods, not a fixed cost. And companies are trying very hard because of the speed of change not to have fixed costs. So you got to balance all of that out, and going through a process of optimizing your workforce and who you hire and for traditional full-time roles, part-time roles, and how you use outside talent is a lot of work. So sorry, that's a quick answer.
That's a great insight for a very, poorly worded question. So thank you very much for playing along with me. Let's go ahead and move forward into the next trend then, and get into yeah.
So generative AI, gosh, what a shocking headline that it's exploding. I use this chart because it's an academic paper. It's from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's a working paper. And also I use it because it does it by age, since we're also talking about age groups and multi-generational things. But, and the way they ask these questions makes it very conservative. It's used at work. It's a broad study of pretty much everybody. It covers all types of work, including people that would never use generative AI. But regardless of which study you look at, it's obviously exploding. And as I said, we've been at this for 25 years as an independent consulting firm. Before that, I did my first study on analysis of the diffusion of innovation looking at PCs in 1981. Which also shows that I'm multi-generational, or I'm at the far end of the generational skew. And there's simply never been anything that has seen the rapid adoption that Gen AI has. And most of that's just due to the fact that it's easy to do, the infrastructure is in place. There's nothing that's even close. So, and the Team Flow Institute has done multiple papers on this already. Everybody listening to this has probably heard more about Gen AI than they want to. But you're not allowed, if as a trends forecaster, we sign a secret agreement every month on what we can and can't do. And you're not allowed to give a presentation unless you talk about generative AI.
All right. Well, now I'm going to go to the heart of this because, again, I've also been fortunate to watch these trends evolve over almost 40 years. And see the different cycles that we've been through, and everyone seems to be the rapid adoption is faster than the last. But over the years, what I've also seen is that they're often led by technology for technology's sake, instead of the inclusion of the human impacts of it. Whereas, one of my first experiences looking at enterprise technology adoption was an organization that rolled out a massive technology change, didn't consult the stakeholders, didn't provide the training up front, didn't communicate it well. And, literally the company was in tatters and ready to go under at that point because of that stuff. And we've seen these lessons over time. Are we doomed to repeat them?
Oh, to a certain degree, yes. I mean, already in our studies, we ask about how'd you get your training? How'd you learn about generative AI? Does your company have generative AI training programs? And the answers from everybody is, I did it myself. No, my company doesn't have training programs. In a lot of cases, they said, my company tells me I can't use generative AI, but I do anyway. And so we're seeing a lot of the same issues. And one reason is companies aren't built to respond to the speed at which this is being deployed. And so training programs haven't been developed. Companies really don't know how to deal with this yet. And that's just what's going on. And one of the big questions is, will there be an ROI for the companies producing this stuff and the companies using this stuff? I happen to notice that Adobe's stock was down almost 15% this morning. I don't know where it is now. And the reason is the financial analysts looked at their financial results and their outlook for and Adobe's been talking about how much money they were going to make because of Gen AI, and the financial results and their outlook for the next year don't match that. Yeah. So there's a big debate right now amongst Wall Street, is the $1 trillion+ that is being invested in building and developing and using Gen AI actually going to have a return? That's a lot of money. And so I think, workers are figuring it out. In our research, we've seen the usage by both traditional employees and freelancers and independent workers. We've seen the usage double at work over last year. And more important, we've seen it become more intense. They're using more AI tools. They're using them more often. And so it's happening. And the big issue is companies are going to have to figure out how to catch up in most cases. And leaders and managers are going to have to figure out how to have this as part of their workforce.
I've got an add-on, and then I got a question for you to stay on this. But The add-on is thinking about early adopters and fast followers. And in this case here, as I've been using the various AIs, there was a point at which the models and how you interacted with them changed every week. And that was real hard to stay up with. And organizations at scale, even harder to do that. So I just, there's a lot of other challenges inside of it, but I want to come up to a higher level and talk about digital transformation, because one of the hypotheses that we're exploring is the idea that digital transformation was never completed. And there is also another corollary to that it will never be complete because technology will always be evolving. But what we've also seen is the number of digital transformation efforts, maybe Adobe, I'm not sure of the inside details there, where it just hasn't been complete. And in many cases, it's coming back to my biased perspective on this whole thing. I believe it's due to a lack of human-centric strategies for how to do it, how to actually make it the realization of the investment appear, so that we can actually have a positive result on that investment. And I'm just curious as to, in the organizations who you think have done their digital transformation well, what have they done differently to actually realize the benefits of it?
Oh, I think the biggest difference is culture. Everything comes back to culture. If you look at the organizations, we work with a number of organizations that have done it well. Now, don't get me wrong, everybody struggles, but we work with firms like Intuit and Google and a bunch of other tech firms that actually have done pretty well with it. They have a culture where change is not just accepted, a lot of the people like it. And so willingness to change, and that's simply the hardest thing to do in a business setting. I mean, humans are resistant to change. We're that's part of our genetics. Evolution taught us change is bad. If you change where you look for water, you might wander someplace else and get eaten. So it's a tough thing, and organizations have to be able to present a really good change management process and approach, and that many of them don't. So I would say it's change management is the difference between the ones that have succeeded. The other issue then is also technical excellence. A lot of companies do not have the technology skills to fully implement digital transformation. And so in those cases, then you've got a bunch of people that are resistant to change, saying that the old way works better. And then they've got some proof statements when the technology doesn't work as well as it should. And so the combination of those two sets, you have to have the technical skills, that's kind of table stakes, and then you have to have the change management skills to make it work.
Another hypothesis or observation we're testing out right now is looking at the spectrum of what does the company value, what is the company foundation, what is the company management, and we're looking at the wide gap, between PE companies and family-owned businesses, regardless of the scale. And anecdotally, because I don't have the research, and this is why we want to do more of this, anecdotally, it seems that the family-owned businesses are the ones that really value their people a lot more, whereas the private equity is very easy to go, oh, we can replace our entire call center with 1,000 AI agents, and it's going to cost us 1/10. Done. We'll do that head counting.
Right.
Have you seen any of that, or any other kind of additional information you might be able to add to that kind of perspective between those two?
Just that a number of large PE firms have what they call the cookbook, and the cookbook's how they go in and, Thoma Bravo is probably the leader in this. They have a very specific cookbook. They have a team of people that go in that are ex-large, consultants from large consulting firms, with the goal of cutting headcount by 20 to 40%. And so, obviously a PE firm is on average is much less people centric. Now they understand if they do too much, they make a mistake, and they're smart people, but yeah, they're going to go for efficiency over, keeping old Ed around that's been doing that job for 20 years. Whereas family run businesses still have sort of the affinity that my company is a family. Now, companies were never a family and never will be a family. And the people who think that they're part of a family when they work for a company need to rethink that, particularly now. But I think that, yeah, absolutely. And the number of firms that are now run by PE firms and or large corporations that are facing the same efficiency issues, maybe to a lesser degree than the PE run ones, they're able to cut and move more quickly. It's true at public corporations too at this point. So yeah, I think the challenge is going to be balance the efficiency that you can get potentially through automation and digital transformation versus what that means to your people and what that means to your culture.
Yeah. Well, one footnote on this, and before we move on to talking about the multi-generational workforce challenges, is that one of the central technical principles in AI is that without a human in the loop, and you can look this up, but without a human in the loop, the AI will collapse on itself. And the central kind of tenet behind that is that it needs to be told what it got right and what it got wrong. And it needs, as we might see if you generate an email or a paper, the writing of the AI often lacks a soul. You can read it and tell that it wasn't human. There's something more formal about it. And so, anyways, it's just the idea that the organizations who are looking at maybe we could have a single leader running the whole thing using AI for the rest of it, or perhaps even the opposite. Maybe we have an AI as our CEO. It's a really brutal binary sort of decision-making system that doesn't take into account intuition or any of these other things that might be in the soft side of it and the squishy in-betweens of some of these very hard numbers that we need to deliver on. So anyways, it's something more to look at as you start thinking about the role of AI within your workforce as a collaborator or as a replacement.
Well, we write a lot and we use AI to help us with outlines and first drafts, but they're not very good at writing. And I laugh. We also use outside freelance writers who are very good at what they do. And I keep telling them, as long as they maintain the skill level that they have, I'm more than happy to pay them lots of money to write our main reports for us because they're so much better than AI. So now the human in the loop thing's so interesting. Just yesterday, we were in a meeting with a large company that's releasing a series of products, and they're in the agentic AI space on this, and so agents, and they discussed agents and then orchestrators of agents. And the orchestrators of agents are other agents. And so they're already figuring out how to layer their agents so that humans don't have to be in the loop. And we talked about the need for humans in the loop. And one of the big issues they're facing is, well, where and why? And so it's going to get interesting quickly.
Well, and part of our perspective on this, and I wrote about this in the AI dividend, is actually where do we invest that AI dividend of the productivity gains? Do we address it in upskilling our people and their overall well-being so they can be better contributors, or do we just take it off the table and put it in our pocket? And it's got to be a mix of the two, I believe, ultimately. But this is really a tremendous opportunity to finally ask ourselves more of those questions about how do we do the work that we're doing? How do we produce this value? Yeah. And it's a really interesting time to be alive, yes, for many reasons. And this is really one of them. But we're running out of time. So I want to move us forward and move into the intergenerational workforce as your next trend here.
All right, next slide. Yeah. So this is pretty quick. Guess what? We have 4 generations in the workforce. We have for a number of times. The share has been shifting over time. 4 generations in the workforce is a little unusual historically, but by 2030, we'll have 5 generations in the workforce, which has never been done. We'll still have 10 to 12% of employees will be 65 and older, and actually right now only about 8% of employees are 65 and older. But we'll have Gen Alpha, which turns 21 in 2034, but will be is that right? Yeah, but we'll be in the workforce by the end of this decade. And so we'll have 5 generations, which has never happened. And so far, generational differences have always been real. And Gen Z entering in is so far being so different. Now you don't want to get too carried away with this. I'm a baby boomer, and when we entered the workforce, we were planning to burn down the nation and burn down major corporations, and then we became the biggest company people ever. So you also have to take in lifestyle effects and other effects. But the reality is the Gen Z group is looking more beyond just work for their life. I mean the mantra is work to live, not live to work. Other generations are actually upset about that at some levels, and other generations are looking at it and going, darn it, why didn't I think that way 20 years ago? So, but in an organizational setting, this can be a very large challenge of working across generations. Whether you have you have old people like me in there that are, neophytes at the new technologies, or we think always keep saying back in my day, and then you have new people wanting change and wanting different things. So it's a big challenge within individual work teams. It's a big challenge across a work organization.
So what's a struggling leader to do? I mean, how can leaders actually bridge these sorts of differences to build a stronger culture?
Well, I have that in my questions for you. Because you're the team expert, I'm the trends expert.
Fair enough. Well, what are you seeing then?
Well, when I look at this stuff, it's very clear that when you're talking about the multi-generational situation, you again have to have organizations that value both new and young ideas, inputs, approaches, but doesn't discriminate against older workers. Now, age discrimination continues to be rife, and as I said, by 2030, the workforce 10% will be older than 65. Between now and 2030, the fastest growing part of the workforce is 75 plus. And by 2030, a little over 10% of all of those that are 75 plus will be working, is the Bureau of Labor Statistics forecast. And so integrating those extremes, we're going to have to learn how to be both as an organization, professional in how we treat both, and equal in how we treat all of these different groups. But we're also going to have a culture that embraces both, old ideas and new ideas, and old people and new people. But it's going to be a huge challenge. It already is a huge challenge.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some parallels here. I'm thinking back to Nesbitt and the mega trends, and what he talks about is a snapback effect, where we'll go too far in a direction and then snap back to the way we were. And I definitely imagine that happening here with AI and the adoption and use of it. Because what I've found is that when I'm working with some of my younger teammates on different projects, they'll come in and they'll present something. I'll go, oh, dude, you did that all with AI. I can tell you didn't edit it. You didn't do anything else with it. But they're not able to ask even the right questions because they don't have the experience and wisdom to establish the context in which the question should be asked. And that changes the nature of the output. Literally, the choice of a word on how we describe something or label it will change the output of any generative AI. And of course, that's getting better with inference and reasoning and a lot of other stuff, but we're still going to have the same challenges because each word is a symbol of a bigger concept that serves as a jumping off point. So I do believe that while AI obviously has a big role and can do a lot for us, without wisdom, the AI is really not as valuable.
I agree with that. There's already been a couple studies showing, though, that relatively inexperienced people gain the most in terms of productivity and efficiency than people that are very skilled and experienced. And so it is kind of an interesting thing. I think you still need that wisdom, but the recent studies have been out of Harvard and BCG and on this topic. So it's going to be, again, we don't know how this is all going to turn out, but from a corporate perspective, and the reason I showed that chart before, it did it by age. And if you just happen to glance at it, you notice that younger workers use AI at about twice the rate of older workers. Yeah, you don't have to put it up.
We're getting ready to move to the next one. I just wanted to make a final point here as well on this, which is actually lost because I started thinking about what you were saying instead of what I was trying to say, which is what I'm supposed to do. So yay on that. But I do see as it's definitely a challenging time. There's a lot of interesting things we can do. Where I've been able to use it is that I'm able to, instead of doing a meeting, taking my notes, going back, synthesizing it, and coming up with new stuff. I'm able to actually take that meeting, and the way I conduct the meeting, and this is actually one of the core team flow principles on meetings, by running that meeting differently, I'm able to get that generated into a project plan or something, within the course of an hour instead of within the course of a week. Mm-hmm. And that sort of multiplier effect is really huge. And I hope more people of the older generations start realizing and figuring out how to use it. But one last point on that. While I'm doing that work, knowing what it is that I want to do and how to do it, I am still learning. And that's one of the most fabulous things for it, because it brings up things I hadn't thought of or I didn't know about, or citing a particular piece of work. And it really is, it's just magnificent and so helpful, but it requires a little more wisdom to really get the true value out of it beyond just those short-term gains. And I think one of the other principles we have, coming back to that financial question, is thinking about long-term value creation instead of short-term.
Okay. Shell Holtz just commented that our stream is frozen, potentially. Maybe just for him. I don't know.
Yeah, Restream to LinkedIn tends to do well. And as long as we're here, unfortunately, that might be for him. But I'm sorry, okay. Shell. Hopefully you hear us. Thank you for bringing that up, because I have been looking at my other notes trying to get this running for us as we're starting to run to the end of time. So the fifth trend we have here, Steve, project-based and agile teams.
Not much to talk about here. Everybody knows that we're ending up being more project and less siloed in terms of our just meeting with our own people. Agiles comes out of the software development world. Studies are showing about a quarter of larger firms actively use Agile now, not just for development, IT, but in other areas. And so they're already common and they're growing faster. And so it just means that our needs for managing cross-functional teams, and we've already talked about that a bit. So that's all I had to say on this one. I think we kind of covered it.
Well, I've got one question on this one that's pretty straightforward, because there are still older leaders who are not keen on a lot of this stuff. So what can leaders do to better adapt to this sort of way of working? Is there something they have to do internally? Is there something they can do tactically or strategically? How are leaders successfully navigating this switch, or how have they?
Well, there's no good answer to that question. I think for the first time, boards are now getting much more involved, at least in the large company world, around what are you doing about these things and how are you managing them and what change are you incurring? So I think they're getting pressure from boards. I think they're getting pressure from their own management teams. And a lot of leaders aren't prepared. When we get down to smaller and mid-sized businesses, we see a lot of businesses where the executives are the reason the company's struggling, and they're not capable of change. And in those cases, those firms are unfortunately going to struggle, and the employees are going to have to find other things to do. There's no magic bullet here in this one.
Let me ask you a specific tension then, because it seems to me that the tension is between the predictability of old waterfall approaches and the need to provide that predictability to the market for public companies, and I don't know, the opposite side. Is it emergence? Is it it is agile, I guess, and the agility to seize opportunities as they come, and risk, and the risk of having to be agile. How are companies balancing that idea of that predictability versus the risk of an agile approach?
Well, most companies are really focused on improving their business flexibility and agility, and that puts a lot more pressure on employees, both in terms. How many companies have sort of declared this, what Mark Zuckerberg calls the year of efficiency, and so that puts a lot more pressure on the employees to perform and a lot more pressure on the teams to perform. But they are also doing this by what they've been doing long term. Let's reduce fixed costs. Let's outsource more stuff. Let's try to get more of our costs linked directly to our revenue instead of being a fixed cost, and that includes employees. And so there's a lot of shifts going on to build more flexibility in. And we haven't talked about resilience, and that's a whole different topic. But right now, resilience to sudden shocks is a really important issue too.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of focus on both of those. And I think along the way, humans kind of get lost.
Yeah.
And employees get lost, and there's an acceptance to a certain degree that, okay, we're gonna raise turnover. And that, as you mentioned before, that's, in some cases they're okay with that. In other cases, they're going to do a lot of damage to their firms.
Yeah, and in this case in particular, the old axiom that the chain's only as strong as the weakest link is really true. And whether it's the team or the whole organization we're looking at, organizational resilience relies on the resilience of individuals and their ability to be able to actually adapt to these changing situations. And so there's a lot to be done on there. I've studied that a lot. For those of you interested in it, I think what it really comes down to is, how do you measure the resilience of your people and your teams? And my friend John Estefanos has a wonderful assessment tool called Rally Bright, in which there is the active resilience quotient. It's actually an assessment tool for teams to measure and examine and talk about their individual and their team resilience. Highly recommend it. But we're here at time, so I'm going to go ahead and go back here, Steve, to go ahead and wrap up a little bit and just share one other thought to kind of put this into perspective about why we're talking about this through the team flow lens. And this is actually the model that Dr. Jeff Van Den Hout produced. What we're looking at, again, at the center is this intrinsic motivating force of the collective ambition, the need for establishing mutual commitment that we actually do what we say we're going to do, to have an audacious team goal that's inspiring, not just a SMART goal, but that BHAG, that big, hairy, audacious goal. And then the alignment of the individual's personal goals with those team goals and with the organization's collective ambition. And all of that stuff here is talking about the direction. So having that clarity of direction is very important up front. Now, as we start looking about the alignment on the right-hand side, going down, looking at the alignment of personal goals and high skill integration, that gets into a lot more of the clarity around your own self-awareness, as well as the awareness of your other team members. And these end up being the building blocks that lead to those sort of greater outcomes. When I know what you're good at and what you're not, and I know what I'm good at and what I'm not, and we have the awareness of that, that's great. But if we don't do that within a cultural environment in which we can feel safe speaking up, in which we can have open communications and talking to one another, in which we can actually have those hard conversations about, you know what, I'm not the best person to be doing that. It's really not going to achieve the level of success that we want. But when we get all of those conditions into place, which, by the way, the 6 rectangles are the things we can really manage, whereas inside of that, the ellipses or the ellipticals are the sense that we get of our success, that knows we're on path to that collective ambition, that sense of unity, that holistic focus, the mutual trust. And trust is so important. Another important book, Speed of Trust, by Stephen Covey Jr. And then through that, we get a sense of joint progress to it. And this all goes on to create that environment where we're able to have that clear sense of direction, clarity of each of our individual roles and our contributions within this cultural environment that allows us to succeed and be our best. And that's really where I fell in love with the team flow model, because this represents many of the things that I've been talking about now for some 20 years. And certainly since the time I left the Big Four consulting job I had, where I discovered that the biggest problem in organizations was people not doing what they said they were going to do. Now, many people may bring that in and say, well, that's internal politics or whatever else, and that's one of the angles we studied. But what it came down to simply was a matter of the culture and the policies and the ability to have those clear and open conversations with one another to say, you know what, other person who I don't directly report to, who's relying on me for your success, I'm not able to do that because I've got this other VP and this VP and I don't have time. So despite the title and the hippo status of some of these people, we have to be able to learn to say no. And we have to be able to stay aligned on, why am I saying no? Because I'm doing this thing that's important to the higher purpose of the organization. And of course, that leads me into OKRs, objectives and key results, and the great work of John Doerr and others in terms of how do we organize and set our direction, and then how do we go about achieving those goals. And the reason for looking at these trends and the workforce transformation and digital transformation through the lens of team flow is, as Steve said, I believe it's where the rubber hits the road. And then if we are able to use this team flow framework, we're able to overcome these trends. And certainly we can apply this framework to looking at each of these, and we'll be doing that over the year ahead with our research. I see we're over 4 minutes. My apologies to you, Steve, for keeping you over, and to the audience for going 4 minutes over, but really feel very happy about what we've been able to produce for people. And hopefully everyone will be able to take a few of these insights now and put it into their 2025 planning and make a real difference, not only in the year ahead, but in the decades ahead at this very critical juncture in history as AI enters the workforce and we really do rethink and change the nature of the organization and the very nature of work itself. Steve, any closing thoughts before we say goodbye for the day?
No, by the way, can you hear me right now?
Yes, sir.
Oh, good. No. It's just that I agree, and we need to figure out for organizations, I'm most interested in making sure that we figure out how small work teams and the individual contributor, thrives in this kind of world. And so, yes, it's a CEO problem, but we've got to get teams in general performing better.
Yeah, and to do that, we need more people to believe in themselves and their ability to contribute and their ability to make a difference. And that requires our ability to feel safe in speaking up, to point out the things we see that are wrong, the things that could be better, or the people who are being excluded that need to be part of the conversations we're having, and 150 other things, and that's the problem. So let's do them one at a time. And thank you so much, Steve King, Emergent Research, one of our Team Flow Institute research fellows, sharing the trends with us and setting us on a really great course for the year ahead. And I'm really looking forward to working more collaboratively with you to explore these trends and produce more solutions that others can follow. Thank you so much, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Awesome. Take care, Steve. Have a great day ahead.
Bye-bye.
This has been the 5 Trends Shaping the Future of Work with our guest, Steve King, a partner at Emergent Research and a senior fellow at the Team Flow Institute. And I am Chris Hewer, the co-founder and managing director. Thank you very much for joining us. Find us online at teamflow.institute.